Let's be real, you're probably sick and tired of using the same boring meta deck season after season. You've always wanted to use a unique deck that you yourself created, but every time you've tried to make one, you quickly realized if you don't switch back to a meta deck, you would never have any real success. Well, today's your lucky day. I'm here to tell you that you can absolutely have a ton of success with your own homemade deck, so long as you follow the steps in this video. Just for reference, I'm nowhere near the best player in the world by any means, but when I played my Graveyard Freeze deck that I made for 6 years straight, I finished in the top 10,000 in the world multiple times and won plenty of grand challenges. When I made this deck, I spent so many hours creating and testing the perfect formula that led me to have the success I had. Luckily for you guys, I'm sharing my secret today and giving you everything that you need to know to make your own deck that is actually good. For those of you guys that have been watching this channel for a while, you'll know that we've already made a video like this a while back, and while this does cover the basics, we wanted to remake it for two reasons. The first one is that the game has changed a ton with things like evolutions and tower troops being added, and the second is I want to go into way more detail here. So with this all being said, get comfortable because this is going to be a long video. Like we've said before, the first thing you need to do when it comes to building a deck is to figure out your playstyle. Your playstyle is just the way that you naturally play the game. Some players tend to play insanely aggressive while others are more defensive. I am very much in the opinion that your playstyle is something that is very difficult to change and that you will have way more success if you line up the type of deck you play with your playstyle. Sure, the pros can switch from Hog Cycle to Lava Hound with no problem, but just because they can do it doesn't mean the rest of us can. If you find yourself using an archetype that doesn't match your playstyle, the deck may just not click for you even if it's objectively good. When it comes to playstyles, there are three main ones to categorize yourself into. The first playstyle is aggressive. This playstyle is for players who can't just help themselves from spamming a bunch of cards. If you're one of those players whose signature move is to drop a Hog Rider, Ice Golem, Ice Period, and Skeletons at the bridge first play, I'm talking to you. Sure, these types of players will randomly catch you off guard with Elite Barbarian's backside and take your tower, but they'll also send a Valkyrie itself straight into an Inferno tower. The second playstyle is passive or defensive. This playstyle is much less common because it is centered around being patient, which is something most Clash Royale players are definitely not known for. Usually in these types of decks, your offense will either come from counter pushes off of your opponent's troops or huge elixir advantages that you've accumulated over the course of the game. As a passive player, your games will rarely end in regulation and will probably go all the way until the tiebreaker pretty often. The last playstyle is what we're calling brain dead, which encompasses using several very low skill cards in the deck to do the work for you. The truth is, most players would see way more success by acknowledging that they have a brain dead playstyle, but very few of us have the self-awareness to admit this. Most of us tend to think that we're way better at the game than we actually are, and we think that we can just pick up these crazy high skill decks just as easily as something like Elixir Golem. You very well could be a truly aggressive or passive player, but in all reality, if you want to maximize your success in as little time as possible, you'll have to do some deep digging and be very honest with yourself about your playstyle. Just as an example, I had a friend in real life who was using some weird log bait variant and was stuck around 6,000 trophies. I gave him an Elixir Golem deck to switch to, and once he got it leveled up to the same level as his old deck, he gained over 2,000 trophies and gets way further in Path of Legends every single season. So if playstyle is so important, how can you figure out what your playstyle actually is? The main way to do this is to simply play the game a ton. As you get more reps in, you'll start to pick up your habits and tendencies. If you find that you enjoy cheaper decks with a faster pace, you may be an aggressive player. If you find yourself always waiting for the perfect time to go on offense and your games are consistently going very well into overtime, you may be a very defensive player. If you find yourself just playing cards and hoping for the best, which most of you probably do if you're being honest with yourself, well, then I'll let you finish that sentence. Another thing you can do here is to compare your tendencies to those that are pros online. See how aggressive you are compared to a pro hog player, or see how defensive you are compared to a pro graveyard player. If there's one thing to take away from this section, it's to be sure to test out a bunch of different decks. Most likely you'll find that you immediately have success with certain types of decks, and this means that you've found your playstyle. The next step is picking your deck archetype. There are 7 main archetypes in Clash Royale that most decks fit into. You have Cycle, Bait, Bridge Spam, Control, Siege, Beatdown, and Split Lane decks. Each one of these deck archetypes loosely fit into one of the 3 playstyle types. Aggressive players should most likely pick between Cycle, Bait, or Bridge Spam, a passive player should pick between Control or Siege, and a brain dead player should choose between Beatdown and Split Lane. Don't overthink this is just a guideline, not a set in stone rule. Now let's get into each playstyle's decks. For an aggressive player, you're going to choose between Cycle, Bait, and Bridge Spam decks. Examples of Cycle decks include things like Hog and Minor Poison, but there are other win conditions that can be classified here too. Win conditions are something that we will discuss more deeply later on, so for now just try to pinpoint the general vibe of the deck that you're going for. One thing to keep in mind here is that the deck can have multiple archetypes. For example, some Expo and Mortar decks are both Siege and Cycle decks, but for the sake of this video we are classifying them both as Siege. Speaking of which, if you find that you're a passive player, your best choices will probably be either Control or Siege. The entire premise of these decks are to be dependent on counter counter pushing, also known as attacking with the troops left over from your defense. Because of the defensive nature of counter pushing, you will need to be a very patient player to play these types of decks well, which most of us honestly aren't. If there is one playstyle that will punish you the hardest for messing up, it's playing defensively, so make sure that you think long and hard before going down this road. Control decks can include decks like Graveyard variants, Miner decks, and most Goblin Drill decks, and Siege is just Expo and Mortar. With these archetypes, your goal is to set the tempo of the match and to strike on a counter push when your opponent is low on elixir. They do have a very low skill floor, meaning they're somewhat difficult to pick up, but the best passive players can almost always make it to the top of the ladder no matter what the state of the game is. One last piece of advice in this section is that all three archetypes ebb and flow with the meta, and in the long run they will all be strong or weak at some point. Make sure you're prioritizing what fits your playstyle instead of what's meta right now, because the meta could be completely different next month. Once you've got your archetype nailed down, the fourth step is to pick your win condition. A win condition is basically a card that you can consistently depend on to deal damage on the tower. An example of a card that's a win condition could be a Hog Rider, and an example of a card that's not a win condition is a Mega Knight. Pay close attention here because this is probably the most common mistake most people make when building a deck. They never pick a win condition. Sure, this might work at low to mid ladder, but the only reason your level 14 Mega Knight always gets to the tower is because you're at 5200 trophies and no one knows how to defend it there. If you ever want the chance to go deep into Ultimate Champion, winning a grand challenge, or placing in a global tournament, you need to have a win condition. If you don't have a card that is specifically designated for taking towers, any player that's half decent would be able to shut you down almost every single time. We'll throw up a graphic on the screen of the win conditions for each archetype, and if your deck doesn't have any of these, then you're going to have to go back to the drawing board. Sometimes it might even make sense to pair two win conditions like a Mortar and a Miner and a Hog. As an example, Giant was one of the worst win conditions in the game before the Dagger Duchess was released. It was completely outclassed by the Goblin Giant, but once the Dagger Duchess came out, the Giant shot up to one of the very top win conditions in the game because it is one of the best counters to it. The only exception is probably the Three Musketeers. They've been useless ever since the heal spell was taken out of the game, which was like 4 years ago. Please don't pick them. Now that you got your archetype and win condition figured out, it's time to pick some support troops. Your support troops are the cards that make up the core of your defense and can also back up your win condition on offense. Certain support troops will synergize better with certain win conditions, so you'll have to think this one through carefully and playtest them all. For example, a Firecracker synergizes great with the Hog because it can easily snipe defending troops and buildings, but it would be terrible to pair with the Graveyard because of the free King Tower activation it gives to any decent player, and for anyone that actually plays Graveyard, you know that activating your opponent's King Tower is basically game over. Not only do support cards synergize with your win condition, but they can also synergize with your other support troops. Take the Fisherman for example. It synergizes great with the Royal Giant because since the Royal Giant attacks from the bridge, the Fisherman can pull defending troops over to your side of the map so your tower can hit it. That's great and all, but you can take it a step further and pair the Fisherman with the Hunter. The Hunter does insane damage, but it has to be right next to its target to do this, which can be hard sometimes. But if you place it right next to the Fisherman, as soon as the Fisherman pulls a troop off of the Royal Giant, the Hunter will absolutely obliterate it. There are a ton of great synergies out there, and luckily you don't have to figure them all out by yourself. If you want to save some time, go to royaleapi.com, look up the win condition you're interested in, and see what cards are commonly used with it by scrolling through the most popular decks that include your win condition. You can also check what cards your win condition usually struggles with, which can be helpful in picking your support cards. Obviously, what Royale API says isn't the end all be all, but it can be really helpful as a starting point. Beyond picking synergies, we've also developed a general rule in picking your support troops. Have at least one splash card and 2 air targeting troops. Especially in lower ladder, people will be spamming a ton of swarm cards, so having a splash card like a Valkyrie or a Bowler is an essential card to have. Also, if you don't have at least 2 air targeting troops, you're just going to get straight up obliterated by the Lava Hound and Balloon. It's not going to be fun. Keep in mind that one card can fulfill both of these requirements, so something like the Evo Wizard could count as both a splash unit and one of the air targeting troops. Also be aware that some archetypes like Cycle may use something like an Ice Spirit as one of their splash cards to get a quicker cycle, but the trade-off is that you're going to have to defend way more carefully against swarms. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how you get there, but for the most part, make sure that you at least meet those requirements. Down the road, if you find that your deck is struggling against swarms or air, you can always add another card in here to compensate. Now on to evolutions. Evolutions are basically super powerful versions of the regular card that you get after using the regular version a certain amount of times. For example, the evolution archers give you a pair of archers that do insane damage at maximum range after you use your regular archers twice. Another example is the evolution goblin giant. The evolution goblin giant spawns goblins after it gets below half health after using the regular version evolution once. I think you understand what I mean, but just remember that the evolution is a really important piece of your deck that can give you a huge advantage over your opponent. There are two routes you can go when picking an evolution for your deck. You can either pick a win condition evolution like the Goblin Giant, Goblin Drill, or Mortar, or you can choose a more generic support troop like the Knights, Skeletons, or Wizard. Just make sure if you choose to get a win condition evolution that you're going to use that win condition for a long time. The advantage of using an evolved win condition is that it usually makes the offensive potential much stronger in your deck, but this comes at a risk when you can only defend with 1 or 0 evolved cards. An evolved support troop can help you on both sides of the map, but obviously you don't have the same offensive potential. It is also much easier to plug a versatile evolution like a Knight into many different archetypes than a win condition like a Goblin Giant. Just be careful with your choice here. Once you've decided what your first evolution is going to be and if it'll fit into your deck well, you'll have to start thinking about your second evolution even if you can't get it yet. Most of you guys watching this video probably don't have this option yet, but when you get later into the game, you actually have 2 evolution slots, meaning that there are way more combinations and possibilities you're going to have to consider with your evolutions. You have to think about how the 2 evolutions cycle together. This isn't always the case, but many players try to get their 2 evolutions at the same time. This means if you have a Goblin Drill evolution and a Wizard evolution in the same deck, it's going to be more difficult to line up the evolutions at the same time because the Wizard is a 1-cycle evolution and the Goblin Drill is a 2-cycle evolution than if you had a Goblin Drill evolution and the Bomber evolution, which are both 2-cycle evolutions. To be real, most of the time this doesn't really matter, but it is something many players try to consider when making their deck. Now that you got your evolutions figured out, it's time to pick some spells. Generally, the rules with spells are pretty simple. Have at least 2 spells, and at least one has to be a small spell. We'll throw up a graphic on the screen now, but usually a big spell is going to be anything that is 4 elixir or more, plus the Earthquake and the Void spell. Your big spell is usually really important for offensive pushes, especially in the late game. Just some examples: a Poison can shut down your opponent's counter to your Goblin Drill, an Earthquake can clear buildings for your Hog, and a Lightning can zap an Inferno Tower so your Royal Giant could break through. Your small spell is a catch-all card that is useful in a lot of different situations. It also fills a defensive hole in your deck. What spells you pick are going to depend on your archetype. Also, don't get too caught up with the elixir cost of your spell. Focus on synergy instead. Many players seem to think that the heavier your deck is, the bigger spell you're going to need, but that's not always true. Sure, a card like the Lightning usually fits better in heavy golem decks, but the Rocket usually shines through in cheap bait decks and cycle decks as a last resort to get tower damage. Your big spell slot is also where you can choose a surprise card like a Freeze. Just because these types of cards aren't in meta decks usually doesn't mean that you can't have success with them, as long as you create good synergies with them. Going back to my homemade deck, it is a way off meta graveyard deck with Freeze and a Witch, and I still did just fine. If you really don't know what big spell to pick, you can never go wrong with picking the Fireball or Poison. They're super versatile cards that are usually pretty strong, and they fit in almost every single deck besides maybe Golem and some Hog and Electro Giant decks. When it comes to your small spell, it's also going to depend on the type of deck you're running. Usually the lighter spells like Zap and Log are going to be better in cheaper decks, and something like Arrows might be better in irregular or slightly expensive decks. Once again though, remember that synergy comes before everything else. Just as an example, the Log has almost always been a better card than the Barbarian Barrel, but the Barb Barrel almost always gets picked over the Log in graveyard decks because the Barbarian that it spawns can tank for the graveyard. Finding these interactions is not easy, and there's nothing wrong with taking inspiration from other successful decks to see all the synergies other people have already thought of. One other thing to note here is that you may find yourself in a situation where your deck only really works with one spell. Usually this isn't ideal, but there are some cases that this might make sense. If this is the setup that you go for, your best bet is to probably choose Arrows or Void as your one spell. Arrows and Void are easily the most versatile spells in the game, and they get tons of value almost every single time you use them. Now we can discuss champions. Champions are the highest rarity for cards in the game, and it is the only rarity that really means something when it comes to gameplay. A champion card allows you to have an ability that is usually super strong. You can also only have one champion inside of your deck. This is partially because a champion card creates a 3-card cycle inside of your deck. You can only have one champion on the map at a time, so when it is on the map, your deck will automatically skip its spot in the cycle, meaning that you can get to specific cards quicker. This is why you see players drop champions in the back of the map to keep them alive longer so that you can cycle more win conditions like Hog Riders and Elixir Golems. All this to say, adding one of the 6 champions will not only add a stronger card to your deck, but it will also allow you to cycle quicker. This means that they are pretty helpful in cycle decks to help you drop more win conditions throughout the game. Champions are definitely not mandatory, but something you should definitely consider when building your deck. Moving on to the next step, we're talking about tower troops. Honestly, this part is pretty simple. Pick the Princess Tower unless you have a very good reason not to. The thing is, the chances of the Princess Tower ever getting nerfed are basically zero because it's kind of the standard of the game. Sure, sometimes there might be a tower troop that is better than the Princess Tower, like the Dagger Duchess was on release, but Supercell hopefully won't let these things stay that way long term. Plus, Clash Royale automatically gives you the resources to upgrade your Princess Tower, so save your wildcards and put them into the rest of your deck. However, there are specific cases where you may want to eventually switch to another tower troop. If your deck continuously struggles against beatdown, you might want to consider the Cannoneer. Be warned though, you'll have to defend swarms way more carefully if you use the Cannoneer. Something as simple as the Tombstone at the bridge will literally wipe out your entire tower if you don't defend it. The same thing goes for the Dagger Duchess, but for swarms. She'll help against lighter cycle decks, but she will struggle a ton against beatdown. You just have to know that everything has a trade-off, and like I said, you should only consider switching your tower troop if your deck has a huge weakness that absolutely needs to be fixed. Switching tower troops should be your last resort, and most of the time I'd highly recommend just sticking with the Princess Tower. Now that we've covered all the basics of building your deck, we're going to move on to how to tweak and refine it over time. Without a doubt, the best way to tweak your deck is through basic trial and error. I've seen so many players sit there for hours thinking about what cards would theoretically fit in their deck best, or whatever, without actually testing it out. The thing is, no matter how good a deck seems on paper, you'll never know how good it actually is until you play it a decent amount. There's just so many possible interactions and scenarios that you would never think of until you're actually in the moment, and the only way you'll figure them all out is by playing the game a ton. Odds are the deck you'll end up with is not going to be the same deck you started with. If you're going to change your deck though, think long and hard before you do it. Just because you got hard counter 3 times in a row doesn't mean the deck is all of a sudden terrible. The more you change your deck, the less likely you'll be able to master it and start to have some real success with it. And besides all of that, until you're maxed, your card levels in your deck matter more than the deck itself. If anything, the most likely change you're going to make is swapping out a support card or two depending on balance changes. Sometimes you're going to have to change something up, but the less often you do it, the better. I'm sure a lot of you guys are free to play, so now I'm going to talk about a way to make a deck that is free to play friendly as possible. Like I said in the last section, if you're not maxed out, your card levels matter way more than the deck itself, so getting all your cards to max as soon as possible should be your top priority. The first thing you need to consider if you want to make a deck as free to play friendly as possible is what card rarities you're putting inside of your deck. You might think that this just means using as many commons and rare cards as possible, but that's actually not the best way to go about this. Ever since the introduction of books and wildcards into the game, the best setup for a free to play friendly deck means that you'll have at least one card of each rarity besides a champion. The reason why you don't want only common and rare cards is because you're going to accumulate epic and legendary books and wildcards over time, and you can use these to upgrade your cards in your deck while you work on commons and rares. If I had to give you the most efficient setup here, it would be something probably like 1 legendary, 2 epics, and the rest commons and rares, but don't feel like you have to stick to exactly that. If you feel like the Little Prince really fits well with your deck, it's probably worth taking a little bit longer to max out to have a better setup in the long run. The main thing to avoid here is running your deck with something like a champion and 4 legendary cards and then complaining that all your cards are under leveled online. The next part of making your deck free to play friendly is sticking with it. Like I said in the last section, once you get a good foundation build, you shouldn't be changing your deck very often at all. If you're a lower level player, don't worry about this part too much, but once you start to get to the end of the trophy road and you want to start pushing high into Path of Legends, you need to have one deck nailed down. Not only will this allow you to max out way quicker, but you'll also be able to push higher on Path of Legends, which means you'll start collecting elite wildcards, also known as the currency to unlock the last upgrade for every single card, level 15. For those of you guys that aren't there yet, I'm warning you right now. Getting cards from level 14 to level 15 is a huge pain because every single card needs 50,000 elite wildcards, and they're very hard to accumulate. The main way to get them is by hitting certain milestones in Path of Legends, and for every single month that you hit Ultimate Champion, you'll have accumulated another 50,000 elite wildcards, also known as a free upgrade to level 15. It'll take time, but if you want to push high ladder as a free-to-play player, optimizing your upgrades from level 1 to 14 and sticking with your deck until you get all level 15s is by far the quickest way to get there. As you start to refine and improve your deck, you may set goals for yourself to achieve down the road. These could be as simple as reaching Ultimate Champion or something way higher like winning a Grand Challenge or getting a top 1000 global tournament finish. Whether you decide to go for it, you'll have to keep in mind that success on ladder and success in challenges are not the same thing. You very well could have a ton of success in Path of Legends but struggle to even get 8 wins in a Grand Challenge because they are totally different. People have this odd misconception that really weird decks you see on ladder go away once you get out of mid ladder, but that's really not true. Unless you're pushing to the very top of the game, I'm talking like top 1000, maybe even 500 in the world, you're going to run into the occasional guy that's playing the most random deck that makes absolutely no sense. The reason for this is because it takes a lot of time and spend money to max out a deck, especially after level 15 was added, and so 99.999% of players can't just switch to the latest meta deck, and even if they could, they wouldn't be near good enough to play and get to that high of a level. This means that on ladder, most decks are going to be way less meta dependent, and the two main things that matter are the card levels and the skill with that specific deck. On the flip side, in challenges, everyone has every single card and every evolution unlocked, so anyone can immediately switch to any deck. If you're trying to win something like a grand challenge, you're going to have to face one of the best decks in the game almost every single game you play, which is going to make it a lot harder to win. You might be asking yourself, well, if I keep losing against all these better decks, then why don't I just switch to one? And the reason is because most of these decks are usually only relevant for a month or two, and then they completely drop off a cliff and are literally never touched again. It's also easier for people to pick up these decks in challenges than on ladder because only a fraction of cards are used in 95% of challenge games, making it way easier to learn all the important matchups and interactions. But the second you take these decks out of the meta bubble and onto ladder, you're going to run into a bunch of random scenarios that you're going to have no idea how to handle. This exact reason is why ladder decks usually struggle in challenges and challenge decks usually struggle in ladder unless you're at the very top of the game. Even though that's the case, assuming you follow all the steps we've given you so far to build a solid deck, you can still have plenty of success in challenges. Going back to my deck, even though it was way off meta, I've won a fair share of grand challenges and beaten tons of pro and top ladder players along the way. Just don't be discouraged if you don't have challenge success right away. I know so many players that are able to secure top 10k finishes on ladder and have never been able to win a grand challenge. Building your own deck is not easy and it takes a ton of time to master, but in my opinion, it's totally worth it to dominate the game in something that is completely your own.